Andy Nathan has been a professor of Chinese politics at Columbia starting several months after we graduated. And I had the opportunity during my time at the college to be a major in what was then called Oriental Studies, which is now East Asian Studies, and to spend 3.5 years in language training, and immediately to go to Columbia for my PhD, which I ended up earning in political science and Chinese politics in 1980. So Andy's first year as a teacher was my first year in graduate school. And I got the chance to take courses with him and to interact with him pretty much after the first semester or two. And so we're looking at our 50th reunion, and he's looking at his 50th year as a faculty member at the college, which I think is in itself extraordinary in terms of commitment and a cry of wisdom. But given all the things that have happened in China and Chinese studies over the last 50 years, he is a great resource of knowledge and experience on that side of things. But all the more significant is the fact that his commitment to pluralism, his commitment to understanding not just the realpolitik, but the underlying forces within Chinese society, and his willingness to take very significant stands, particularly after Tiananmen, is remarkable. And I think it's somewhat accidental, but also somewhat significant that this is June 4th, the 32nd year following the Tiananmen incident, which Andy can, if he chooses to, go into some of the significance that those events had in his life and his viewpoint on Chinese politics. But just further by way of introduction, I think in his 50 years, and hopefully there are quite a few to follow, Andy was an exemplary advisor, an advocate for students, an advocate for the China field. He was chairman of the political science department for a time, chairman of the East Asian Institute for a time. And I think it's fair to say throughout those administrative tasks, he demonstrated a particular concern for students and for the conditions of teaching and the faculty role that really made the East Asian Institute and the Chinese studies community, as well as the political science department, really student-friendly, intellectually friendly, really quite diverse in terms of both student enrollment and faculty participation. In my 4 years in the college, it was very rare to find a Chinese teacher, an ethnicity teacher of Chinese descent, teaching anything but the language in the college and in the university, and that changed dramatically in the 80s and 90s, to the point that now I think, and Andy can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that Chinese politics and the East Asian Institute and the political science department are as varied in ethnicity, varied in viewpoint, but committed to the human understanding of Chinese society as anywhere else in the academic world, as far as I'm concerned. So just by conclusion, without having gone over exactly what Andy's going to say by a long shot, I think that his concern for pluralism has really been very rare, both in his activities as a teacher, but also as an academic. He's written definitive books about Chinese democracy, a topic that is not at the top of anyone's tongue at this point, but still as an underlying trend, and one that has come forward at various points, is a really significant factor, I think, in what happens in the future. And It's my pleasure to welcome Andy Nathan to speak as our faculty presenter.
Thank you, Larry. That's a very kind introduction. Congratulations to all you guys for having graduated from the college 50 years ago and surviving to now to this reunion. When Larry and I got to know each other, as he says in his first year of grad school, Columbia was pretty different from what it is now, at least in the parts of Columbia that I occupy. It's very true that after the normalization of US-China relations in 1979, we began to have a lot of Chinese students, both in the PhD program in political science and in the college, and that continues to be the case. And as Larry said, with the production in various American universities and departments of a lot of PhDs coming from China, there's been a great diversification of the faculty at Columbia in all of our departments and in other universities. A lot of Chinese people teaching about China, about politics, sociology, film, and all literature and all the different subjects that we teach, as well as many Chinese people in the science department. So that is a thing. The university hasn't done as well in diversity with respect to African Americans. From President Bollinger on down to the departments, it's an effort, it's a conscious effort to try to improve in that respect, and it's very slow. I don't think any of us are really satisfied. Larry mentioned today being the 32nd anniversary of Tiananmen, and he alluded to something. I'll just explain a little bit more about it in case you're interested, which is that in 2001, I was the co-editor of a book called the Tiananmen Papers, which is, I don't know if any of you know anything about it. There's sort of a long story behind it, but I was approached by somebody from China who said that what the government did in Tiananmen was a disaster, cracking down on the democracy movement and the students and using the army to kill some number. We still don't to this day know how many. And he said, I have all these documents from inside of the government and inside of the party tracing their ultimate decision for this crackdown. I want to publish them. And this set me off on a long experience of authenticating the documents, talking to lawyers, publishers about what I was getting into, and then organizing and supervising the translation of the documents, which came out in 2001 and created quite a stir at that time. So if any of you are interested, you can look up that book. You can still get it on Amazon or in the Q&A. We can talk more about it if you like. And since the publication of that book, I've been banned from China. They won't give me a visa. But that brings me to, so when Larry and I were setting up this talk, he encouraged me both to give a substantive talk, which I'm going to get to in a moment, and also to reminisce a little bit about teaching at Columbia for 50 years. And one of the points that comes up when I mention the Tiananmen Papers and teaching at Columbia for 50 years is the point about academic freedom, which is to say that the university, this book was controversial. It angered the Chinese government, but all of my colleagues and the university administration have never given me any trouble about it or about the other human rights work that I've been engaged in, helping Chinese dissidents and things like that. I've got that freedom. Fortunately, when the Tiananmen Papers were published, I already had tenure. It would be different for a younger person who doesn't have tenure to be banned from China, because it would be hard for that person to do cutting edge research if he or she couldn't get into China. So I really appreciate the academic freedom. There was even a point along the way when I was at a dinner with President Bollinger and some other members of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. And one of the other people said, you know, Nathan, it came up and the Bollinger was thinking of planning something or other with China. And somebody said, Nathan can't go, he's banned. And the next day I got a phone call from Bollinger saying, I didn't know you were banned. Do you want me to do something about it? And I was very impressed with his willingness to do so. But I said, don't. The university has it. First of all, the Chinese, you know, they can ban, publishing the book was an attack on the Chinese government in a way, political. And if they want to ban me, it's their business. And I don't want to in any way disrupt the hundreds and hundreds of connections that different university units have with China, many of, almost all of which I would say are very beneficial and constructive. I'll say two more things. Larry mentioned the strength of, or he alluded to the fact that the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, it's now called Weatherhead East Asian Institute because of a large endowment from the Weatherhead Foundation, is, I don't know the exact rank number, it's one of the top, maybe it's the best or the second or third best university-based centers on the study of East Asia, China, Japan, Korea, including Southeast Asia, Tibet. And if you go on the website of Weatherhead East Asian Institute, you will see the faculty. It's a very large, diverse, distinguished faculty. As Larry said, quite a few ethnic Chinese on that faculty. And you can also click on a link that would get you a weekly newsletter of activities of the Institute, which for this past year and more have been completely online. And I think when we go back to campus, we're probably going to start to broadcast our in-person events online as well. So even if you're in Latvia, you can click on it and participate in it. And the other unit I want to mention is the political science department, which is where I teach and where Larry got his degree, which has been ranked as one of the top 5 departments. So I feel very fortunate in my colleagues and students. And the last thing I want to say is that before we got on this call, Larry and I were reminiscing. Larry came to the screen not only with the beautiful white shirt and blue necktie that you see on him, but a jacket. And I said to him, you better take off your jacket because you're making me feel underdressed, you know, so he kindly took off his jacket. But I'm probably the last person in my department, when I go to campus, I wear a tie and jacket. At least that was true before COVID. For 50 years, or for the then 49 years, I went with a tie and jacket to class. And as I grew from the status of a junior faculty member who was overwhelmed and intimidated by the old fogies in my department and grew into the status of an old fogey myself, I think I'm the member of the poli-sci department faculty who's been there the longest. Although there's one person in the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, Myron Cohen, who's been, remember him, Larry, who's been there longer than I have. As I've grown into the old fogey status, I've noticed that all the young people and middle-aged people and early old people, everybody else, is dressing more and more informally. And I'm stubborn. I'm like, no, I'm gonna wear this damn tie and jacket till I plots. So that's where I am. But for the online thing, I don't do that. It seems a little bit excessive. So I just wear this shirt, and you guys have no idea whether I'm wearing long pants, short pants, socks, shoes, or what. But that's the online environment. And behind me is a picture of my office on campus, but I have not been there since March of 2020. But the campus is we're going to be back to in-person, some form of in-person instruction in September, they tell us, unless things take a turn for the worse. Okay, that's the reminiscence portion, which I could have gone on for the entire hour, but that's the reminiscence portion of my remarks. And so I want to go to some substantive remarks. And the topic that we agreed on. I don't know what you guys heard it was going to be the topic, but in the end of the day, we agreed on the topic of Biden's China policy. Is it the same or different from Trump's China policy? Old wine in new bottles, question mark. And so I want to talk about that. And I really should only take another 20 minutes. So it's a half an hour, a little less than half an hour to sort of run over this. Of course, it's a complicated topic so that we have some time left for discussion. So I think in the news today yesterday was the announcement that the Biden administration has decided to continue and to expand a decision of the Trump administration to forbid American investment in a wide range of Chinese companies that the US government believes are producing products either for the Chinese military or for electronic surveillance of Chinese citizens in a way that violates human rights. So in other words, the Biden administration has taken a Trump policy and has continued and expanded it, a Trump policy that is based on the view that China is an antagonistic power. The Biden administration has also not lifted the tariffs that Trump put on China. And the Biden administration has continued Trump's policy of developing a cooperative arrangement. It's not a formal alliance, but a cooperative set of meetings and military exercises and political positions by 4 countries called the Quad. And that is the United States, Japan, Australia, and India. Of course, Japan and Australia are treaty allies of the United States. And the United States, for many, many years, I'd say 3 decades or so, has been trying to obtain Indian cooperation with American strategic priorities in Asia. And the Indians have been very reluctant to get on board the American or any other wagon. But they did under Trump, India did under Trump agree to participate in this sort of semi-symbolic, semi-real set of relationships called the Quad, and the Biden administration has continued that. And the Biden administration, in articulating for the public what its China policy is, has borrowed and sort of elaborated a core concept under Trump, which is the concept of strategic competitor. So during the Trump administration, a policy document was issued that labeled China as a strategic competitor. And the issuance of that document was the culmination of a process of disillusionment on the part of American policymakers with the possibilities of building a cooperative relationship with China. So it's not that Trump turned night into day exactly, but Trump did sort of culminate this process. So the process probably goes back to the Obama administration. Of course, there's always debate in the American political system about any foreign policy issue. And one of the abiding debates has been, is China a potential friend or an inevitable enemy? But and will the rise of China spell eventually a severe challenge for the United States? And if so, how severe? Is it an existential challenge or what? So in the Obama administration, you already had people saying China's getting too big and too strong and too assertive, and we need to do something that Obama labeled the pivot to Asia, which was an idea that the US, that the most important region of the world for American interests is Asia, not Europe, not Latin America. Of course, every place is important, but Asia is more important because it's the biggest part of the world economy taken as a whole region. And America is a Pacific power. So there was always that view, but there was the view for a long time, really starting with Nixon, that if we're nice to China and we let China get prosperous, China will love us and China will become what one George W. Bush policymaker, called a responsible power. But as China got richer, built up its navy, built up its missile force, and consolidated the control of the Chinese Communist Party and its assertion of authoritarian values under Obama, the policymakers began to think we need to, show ourselves in Asia, push back a little bit, pivot into Asia, and show that we're big and strong, so that our engagement policy with China would send the right message to the Chinese that we want to love you, but we're not going to let you get away with stuff that's adverse to us and our allies in Japan, South Korea, or to Taiwan, which is not a formal treaty ally, but is an important entity protected by US guarantees. But it was only when Trump came in that he dramatically said, okay, the whole game of engagement with China is off. And the Trump administration was kind of chaotic in every policy area, but specifically with respect to China, there were a lot of different, you might say, factions in the Trump administration with a range of views. Trump was sort of a faction unto himself. He was fascinated with the trade problem, trade deficit, and said it was easy to fix it. And that seemed to be all that he worried about, was trade and whether he could get a good market for the Midwestern farmers so that he could get reelected and so forth. Then there was trade, Trump's China policy advisor, Peter Navarro, whose dream was to completely, something called decoupling, completely cut off US-China economic relations as completely as one could possibly imagine, which might not be 100%, but as much as possible. Then there was the sort of Jared Kushner, Stephen Mnuchin group who wanted to keep doors open for the financial business in China. There was the Vice President Pence and Secretary of State Pompeo, who had a very strong interest in evangelical Christianity and really emphasized a lot on religious freedom and so on. But in the center of this mess, there was a document that came out that was an official document written by lots of different government agencies and concurred in by different agencies that used this term strategic competitor, which seemed to be a sort of balanced assessment, saying that China's rise means that they no longer trail along behind us doing what we want to do. They want to compete, and we're not sure they want to compete to what level. Do they want to replace American power globally, or do they just want to kick us out of Asia, or do they just want a balance of power in Asia? It wasn't clear, but it was clear that they're a competitor and that competition is of strategic significance. It's not just merely economic. It has to do with the global order. It has to do with global values and so forth. So that was a turn that the Biden administration has accepted, and which has become very, very widely accepted in the American political community, in government, outside of government, in think tanks, in academia, in the media, that China represents a strategic competition. Now, so the debate has shifted. So there are now very few people who say, no, we need to find a way to be, China's not trying to overthrow the whole world, and they're not really all that bad, and we have to set aside, we have disagreements, but we need to try to be friends. That's one extreme that really has pretty much disappeared. And then there's another view moving sort of more toward the center that says, we don't like the Chinese system, but it's here to survive, and we better find a way to have a balance of power, or what some people call a condominium, two powers dominating Asia together as cooperatively or with as many ground rules as possible, all the way over to the far side of the policy spectrum of people who say Steve Bannon or Pompeo himself, whose position is, or Newt Gingrich, all of whom have been quoted in basically saying the rise of Chinese communism as a power represents an existential threat to Western civilization, often really meaning Christian civilization. And we have to find some way to really stop this, but they never have a concrete answer. Some people would say, well, let's give an explicit guarantee of Taiwan's security with the idea that, okay, if you want to trigger a war, let's have a war now. And some people say, let's encourage the Chinese people to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party. So these kind of ideas are on the far, I'll call it right, for the sake of convenience and because of where I am standing here. So the policy debate really runs between those who feel like we should have some sort of an accommodation with China, not because we like them or expect cooperation from them, but because they exist, over to the side that says we have to be unfriendly to them across the whole domain of policy options and policy tools that we have. Within that debate, so point one is to say, yes, that the Biden administration has inherited this kind of core concept of strategic competition, along with some of the measures to policy tools that the Trump administration introduced. And I say the Trump administration because I think that Trump himself was only into the tariffs, but there were other members of the administration. And I would point, if you want to dig into this a little bit more, I would specifically point to a guy named Matthew Pottinger, who was the head of the Asia head of Trump's National Security Council, and who I think had a lot to do with working out the specific policy measures that I have alluded to, the Quad and the ban on investment in certain companies and so forth, and who's a professional. This guy, unlike Trump, is a professional, knows China, speaks Chinese, and is serious policy intellectual now at the Hoover Institution, having served the entire length of the Trump administration. So part one, Biden has inherited this basic strategic orientation. However, part two of what I want to say here is that the Biden implementation of this policy is really very different. And I think I have 5 ways that I want to mention of how it's different. The first difference is that the Biden China policy is coordinated. Excuse me, I'm going to sneeze, I think. So Biden runs a much more orderly policy shop, as almost anybody would, because Trump's policy shop was completely chaotic. Biden runs a markedly orderly policy shop where there's a guy named Kurt Campbell, who is the so-called Asia czar of the National Security Council. And the government appears to me to be all on the same page with respect to China policy. So coordination and the strategic competition in the case of the Biden administration is really strategic. Excuse me, actually is strategic in the sense of having a set of goals in view and a set of means that are adapted to those goals. Second thing to say about the strategic competition under Biden is, what is the strategy? And it consists, first of all, of working with allies. So as you know, Trump damaged the relationship with a lot of allies, particularly those in Europe, but also in Asia, because although the Japanese under Shinzo Abe made a big effort to stay on the right side of Trump, and I guess they basically succeeded, but they could see what you and I could see, that the policy making was inconsistent and ineffective, and that Trump was sort of a wild card. For example, his 3 meetings with Kim Jong-un of North Korea, which produced no progress in the end, and which did not take into consideration Japanese and South Korean advice and concerns. Those and his lack of clarity about whether the United States was would under all circumstances honor its defense commitment to Japan. Those kinds of things, although Abe kept a good gloss on the relationship, really challenged the faith of our Asian allies in the American commitment. So the Biden administration has worked very hard with constant meetings and statements to re-up the confidence of allies in the relationship, with the thought that in strategic competition with China, the United States alone cannot be successful. It requires the cooperation of as many countries as possible to stand for the things that the United States stands for, which generally are considered to be democracy, human rights, and something called the liberal international order. So we're talking at a very high level of sort of rhetorical abstraction, but you want to get as many allies to agree to those things and to operationalize those things. Excuse me for a moment. So that you're presenting to the Chinese an impressive common front. The second thing is multilateralism, to re-enter the climate accord, to re-enter the Iran Accord, to resume cooperation with the World Health Organization, to resume being an active player in the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. In other words, that our ability to constrain the choices of China, or to send a message to China that you won't get away with X, Y, Z, the ability to persuade China in those ways depends upon being there in all the multilateral institutions, so that not only a group of allies, but also various institutional frameworks will stiffen their spine to insist upon the rules of the road that the United States has, that benefit the United States, in which the United States had some role in creating. So with respect, for example, to the World Health Organization, is China going to cooperate with data about pandemics that emanate from China, about the question of whether there was a leak from the Wuhan Virus Research Agency? Is China going to cooperate? Is it going to have to answer for human rights issues in Geneva and so on? So allies, multilateral institutions. Thirdly, the Biden administration has placed a heavier emphasis than the Trump administration on human rights. So as I said before, that Pompeo and Pence in particular did keep hitting the issue of religious freedom. And at the end of the Trump administration, Pompeo declared the Chinese internment of Uyghur and other Muslim citizens in Xinjiang as a genocide. The Biden administration has not withdrawn that statement, but in the case of the Trump people who made that label, it was around religious freedom. But the Biden administration has opened the aperture to the whole range of human rights issues in China, which there are many. Not only the Xinjiang issue, but the Hong Kong issue, the imprisonment of so-called rights protection lawyers, the arrests of Christians who practice outside of the official Christian hierarchy, the suppression of feminist movement, control over all kinds of civil society organizations. The Biden administration has upped the ante on human rights with the thought that human rights is one of the core elements of American, if you will, soft power. One of the things about the United States that in the, however much there's a double standard and however many problems we have, nonetheless is one of the things that makes the United States more welcome around the world, influence of the United States more welcome. And that it's, on the flip side, it's a weakness of China that although there are a lot of countries that welcome Chinese financial help through the thing called the Belt and Road Initiative, where China's investing money and sending engineers and workers and cement and iron to some estimated 80 countries around the world for building of infrastructure financed by China that makes China welcome in these places. But in these places, China is not entirely welcome because, and it depends on who you're talking to in each country, but among many people, because of China's bad human rights record, that there are lots of people in these various recipient countries of the Belt and Road Initiative who would take the money but don't really like the Chinese values and the Chinese system. Another element of the Biden policy that's different from the Trump policy is to seek some areas of cooperation. So there was nobody in the Trump administration who really was working that portfolio. Everybody was busy with his or her particular domain of antagonism to China. But in the Trump administration, for example, John Kerry, the climate, what's his official title, the guy in charge of getting the world together to fight climate change, has visited China and has said to the Chinese, look, you and we are the two big climate emitters of climate warming gases. And if we don't work on it, then the world is going to burn up. So we need to cooperate. And he met with the chief climate policy making guy in the Chinese government. And I don't believe it's been announced what they agreed to, or they had a friendly meeting. Some Chinese officials have put it out saying, if you're going to criticize us on human rights, it's going to ruin the atmosphere in the relationship, and we won't be able to cooperate with you on climate. But I think I know that the Biden administration is going to do both, see if they can. They're going to continue to make criticisms on human rights, which are just criticisms, right? We're not actually, and we couldn't, in fact, do anything to take control over what's happening in Xinjiang. All we can do is really to criticize. And of course, there's this movement we might not send officials to the Beijing Olympics. There's a movement in the consumer community to not buy clothing made with Xinjiang cotton and so on, and Xinjiang mining materials that are in electronics, that we have to diversify our supply. So there are things that civil society can do that might or might not really have any influence on Chinese behavior in Xinjiang, but the government will continue to raise issues like this while, Who? Somebody want to speak or go on mute? While seeking areas of cooperation, climate is the most important of those, I guess, or the most, let's say, ripe for cooperation, because there really is an overwhelming common interest. Global public health is another area. North Korea is an area for potential cooperation. Iran is an area for potential cooperation. Now, cooperation is always extremely difficult because you can say at a high level of generality that China and the US both have an interest in cooperating on climate, but immediately you get into the question of who bears what burden, who gets what benefit. So let's take the example of solar panels. If we're going to fix climate, we need to produce and install more solar panels. Somebody's going to get rich producing and selling solar panels. Is it going to be me? Is it going to be you? We're going to cooperate, but I want the profit from the solar panels. And this is a game that has already played out in the last decade, where China globally sold solar panels at a price that undercut American and German solar panels and got a large share of the market. So as we go forward into hydrogen powered vehicles and new batteries and carbon, what do you call it? Carbon, not the word, but burying technology. I forget the term for it. There's always going to be competition, and the same thing in terms of 21st century technologies of health, of autonomous vehicles, artificial intelligence, and so on. So you can't just divide up the pie equitably. There'll be sharp competition, but it can be competition under the rubric in some of these areas of both driving toward a similar goal with some communication. And fifth, I think, I don't know if I'm fifth or what number I'm up to, but last, about how the Biden policy is different from the Trump policy, is that I don't believe that the Biden administration has anybody in it who's driving for full decoupling of the two economies, which realistically speaking is not possible, because there are many, many products that we buy from China that there's nowhere else to get them in that quantity. Of course, the global economy is always changing, and as cost of labor goes up in China, there will be manufacturing will move to Vietnam or to Bangladesh or Indonesia in certain areas, and then what China sells us will move up the value chain. So I'm not saying that things are going to be static, but I'm going to say that China is such a huge economy that both from the trade point of view, what we buy from them and what we sell from them, and from the investment point of view, with our investors having to be in that economy, which continues to grow quite fast. They're now projecting for 2021 a 6.2, I think, percent growth rate. You really cannot completely decouple, but there will be areas of decoupling that are deemed to be the strategic areas where you cannot depend on any foreign supplier. And we're discovering what those are. And that includes high-end computer chips. It includes certain pharmaceutical ingredients. It includes rare earths, where from a strategic point of view, no matter what the cost might be, we have to be relatively self-sufficient. So that decoupling will take place. And I think one of the important areas for this century of decoupling is going to be in the digital area, because nobody really can trust anybody else. So with 5G technology, for example, the Trump administration said if you install Huawei's 5G technology, the Chinese will be able to spy on you. And I'm not a digital expert, but I believe this is obvious enough so that even a non-digital expert can believe it. It's true. If you buy, on the other hand, American 5G technology, once that is available, the Americans can spy on you. So if you're the United States, you're not going to buy the Chinese technology. If you're Germany, you will probably prefer the having the Americans spy on you to having the Chinese spy on you. And it's possible that the Europeans will develop their own 5G technology. So some decoupling is inevitable, but the Biden policy is not to go for complete discoupling. I think I should probably basically stop here. What I would say to conclude is that I think this Biden policy makes sense, but it doesn't spell a happily ever after kind of a situation. China sees the world. I mean, today we chose the topic of American China policy, but if we had a different lecture on Chinese policy toward America, the Chinese government policymakers, and it's not just Xi Jinping being a tough guy or something, it's a very, very widespread view in China, is that the American power has been deployed in a way that is unfriendly and threatening to China. There's a long history to that. Larry has studied that history, and the Chinese feel that their country can never be secure as long as the United States has the upper hand over them, whether it's with respect to military deployments or technology. And in particular, the American presence in Taiwan is viewed by the Chinese as really a severe threat to their security. So the Chinese are not satisfied with the state of affairs in the world. They will try to change it. They have very strong reasons that they're not going to just come around and say, I'm sorry, I misunderstood. You guys are nice. We can be friends. That's not going to happen. So we are going to be in for a period of time. You and I and our children and maybe our grandchildren are going to be in for a long period of time where the US-China so-called strategic competition is very scary, tense, serious, and particularly around the issue of Taiwan, which in the United States, we often tend to sort of view as a peripheral issue, is a very, very dangerous issue because the Chinese are determined to have control over Taiwan for reasons that are very reasonable from where they sit. Whereas we are very much locked into the so-called peaceful resolution of the Taiwan issue, which essentially means that we're opposed to any Chinese military attack on Taiwan, but the military balance between us and the Chinese around Taiwan has deteriorated severely. And so it's a very dangerous time around that, and it could lead to an armed clash. I don't think it would be escalated to a world war, but it would still be a really serious event. And so it's not going to be easy, but I think that the Biden administration is on the right track in the various elements that I mentioned: allies, multilateralism, human rights, cooperation with competition, and limited decoupling. And if we can all sort of hold on to our seats, we may get through what is probably a several decades long process of testing each other and come out the other end without an absolute tragedy taking place. So Larry, let me leave it there, very quick overview, and invite folks to come into the conversation.
Well, that's terrific, Andy. You're right on schedule. And I just want to take the opportunity of asking the first question, which is that in the political science field and beyond the disciplines of comparative politics, international relations, all of that, one of the evolving ideas, at least when I was finishing graduate school, was this idea of political culture and cultural politics and things that were outside the government to government or strategic side. So with that on the one hand, and then the concept of guanxi, of relationships, being so significant in China, I just wonder what your reaction is to the plethora of relationships, student to student, student to faculty, faculty to faculty, cultural institution to cultural institution, those things that were absolutely impossible in terms of the US and PRC when we were in college or when we were in graduate school, that I think any of us can think of, whether it's a religious institution, whether it's a business, whether it's an educational institution, that suddenly there are these relationships that we have, that our children have, that our grandchildren are having, that we could never conceive of in our time between PRC citizens and American citizens. PRC institutions, cultural institutions, business institutions, informal institutions, and American institutions. Do you see this as a differentiating factor in terms of how the overall US-China relationship might develop that has not really been so much of a factor, particularly with non-European countries, but as immigration with so many different parts of the world are leading to changed perceptions on both sides, of American culture, of American politics, American economics, and those of other countries. Is this something that at all has relevance to some of the issues that you were raising?
Yes. So there used to be about 300,000 Chinese students and scholars in the United States every year. And then COVID interfered with that. But the Trump administration also was trying to make it harder for those people to get visas. And the Biden administration has, coming out of COVID, is making it easier for those, again, easier like it used to be in the past for people to get those visas. Because I think that the people-to-people relationship is partly educational and partly business, is a hugely important ballast, if you will, steadier to the relationship. I mean, it has its own intrinsic value. So I think that the arrival of Chinese students, I mentioned before, Chinese students coming to our PhD program has been a tremendous benefit to us who study China and just in general, and the Chinese who've come here and studied science and then have settled down in our own universities. You know, it's great. Very important benefit for us intrinsically, but also in the relationship between the two societies. However, though, I think the downside is that on issues like Taiwan, for example, these are issues that are made, that society doesn't influence that much, that are, made in the pinnacle of the policy makers. And as I tried to describe that, both in Beijing and Washington, Taiwan is considered a non-compromisable issue, but it's not. It's a zero-sum thing. Taiwan, either one side has its way or the other side. It's not something you can compromise with. So I don't think that some people are calling the US-China relationship a new Cold War. In the old Cold War, we had almost zero educational and business relationships with the Soviet Union. So this is a very valuable factor. And I think the Biden people want to treat it as such, but it won't save us from scary times around certain issues. There's somebody in the chat. Let me see what the chat says. Question from James. How can America survive the public onboarding? America first, damn the rest. Politicians again. How can America survive the American first politicians again taking the lead in directing international affairs? Oh yeah, I agree that if the Trumpist wing of the Republican Party comes back, if Pompeo, for example, or Trump were to win the presidency, I think that the Chinese long-term strategy, there's a big debate among American China specialists about how vast is Xi Jinping's strategic vision? So he has articulated, for example, that by this year, July 1 is the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And Xi Jinping has articulated that on this 100th anniversary, China should be I think he says, moderately prosperous society. And then on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China, which would be 2049, China should be a highly modernized socialist society. So Xi Jinping has this vision. It's kind of vague what it is. And then we ask ourselves, what does that mean for international relations? What is Xi Jinping's long-term vision for China's role in the world? And it's a debate. And there's a book that has just come out, and I blank the name of the book, but the author is a guy named Rush Doshi, D-O-S-H-I, an American of Indian background, who is in the Biden administration. He was at the Brookings Institution and he wrote this book, and then he went into the Biden National Security Council as a senior director for Asia. And in that book, he says, China's long-term strategy is to replace, quote unquote, replace the United States as the number one power. What would that mean? That would mean that in some way we're all it doesn't mean that we're going to be governed directly by Chinese citizens, we're not going to become like a colony of China, but it means that we're going to play by the rules. So it would mean, for example, that Columbia University would fire Andy Nathan. That would be the rules of the game, because I'm doing human rights work. I'm publishing the Tiananmen papers, and the Chinese would talk to the president of the university and say, you know what, if you better get rid of this guy. That would be the world. So now wait, Larry. So I think that the Chinese thought we're going to move slow, whatever their vision is, and we don't know what it is. Their thought was we'll move there slowly, slowly. And then when Trump comes in, they see the United States wrecking its own power around the world. So my answer to James's question is, if we have another government like this, we're going to accelerate the decline of American power in the world, and we're just going to hand a gift to the Chinese. Here's a question from David Chu. Is there a risk? By the way, you can, if you want to ask, somebody has his hand up, so I'll go to you next. But if you want to put your hand up or just even.
Yeah, Ed Eiches is what I heard, the person who's got his hand up. If you can call
Okay,
on.
but should I take the one from the chat or go to Ed first?
There was just a suggestion that Ed go first, but.
Okay, Ed. Unmute yourself.
Okay. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so my question concerns the definition of human rights. That is a lot, think of it as also, housing. I was in China before recognition. I used to be invited by the Translation Bureau until 2007, when I gave a speech at the Marxist-Leninist Institute in Shanghai on why the government monopoly on unions is stupid, and why there should be some type of privatization of unions. That was the end of my ability to go to China.
Yeah. Well, okay. Is that a question or just?
The question is that in many ways, especially now, the Chinese are doing a lot better than the United States in terms of providing housing and providing food. And that's what the Chinese say those are human rights, just like some kind of Western conception of democracy.
I see. Yeah. So one answer to the question of what is human rights is to look at the international law of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the Convention Against the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, yakety, 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 down the line, and say, this is human rights. It's indivisible. All parts of it are equally important. And then there's the Chinese view, which is not only Chinese, but shared by a number of other governments, that some human rights are more central than others, and you have to be fed and clothed and housed before you can start to talk about other rights, such as freedom of speech and association and publication. The Chinese also articulate a third view, which is to say, yes, we recognize the rights of speech and association, but each government interprets the meaning of those rights in its own way, as befits the national conditions and policy priorities of a particular government. So there is this debate. And as Ed said, that the Chinese side is on one side of that debate. My own answer would be to the first version. Okay, let me go to David Chu. Is there a reciprocity of exchange students to China from the US? How do the numbers and results compare? So there's much, much more Chinese students coming to the United States than there are American students going to China, but it's not because the Chinese are refusing American students. They welcome them, but it's just because of the relative imbalance of interest. So students who go from the United States to China are chiefly students interested in studying China, learning Chinese. And those coming here are learning fintech and statistics and engineering and physics and so on. So there's a certain imbalance, but it doesn't, I wouldn't, if by reciprocity one means sort of equal access, then I think there's reciprocity, but it doesn't lead to the same outcome. From Sarah?
Andy, if I could just jump
Yeah.
in, there's a participant, Erwin Warren, who was just asking me to ask you in terms of Hong Kong and what's
Yeah.
going on in Hong Kong now, day to day.
Uh,
And, you know, what he's calling, and I agree, the worst attack on an intimidation of democracy
yeah.
we've seen in a while. Is there anyone who can criticize the government without being jailed, as far as you know?
No, I don't think you can if you're in Hong Kong. It's very dangerous. So today's June 4th. They normally have this huge Victoria Park demonstration or memorial service. That's been crushed. Somebody, who did I hear about this morning, who was arrested for some action like walking in the street with a candle or something of that particular type. And the national security law in Hong Kong is actually asserts extraterritorial jurisdiction. That is to say, on the text of the national security law, they can arrest Erwin now for having asked this question. Where is he? Look out. Of course, you know, they're not going to do that. It's not that easy, but the law does not protect you if you're outside of Hong Kong either. So you're right.
My question, if I can jump in, is how is anybody going to do the academic research you talked about earlier? You spoke about the issues of being a China scholar. How is anybody going to do this now in Hong Kong?
So do you mean research on Hong Kong or research on China?
Yes. No,
Yeah.
research on Hong Kong.
Research
How is
on
anybody
Hong Kong.
going to do the original on the ground research, because you can't attribute anything?
Well, I don't think there's been much on the ground research. Well, there's plenty of research that you can do in Hong Kong on urban planning. You know, the Hong Kong has a number of very, very good universities. The Hong Kong University, Chinese University of Hong Kong, Hong Kong Science and Tech University, Baptist College, and so forth, where there are plenty of research going on many scientific and technological, sociological, demographic topics and stuff like that. It's not a problem. But if you want to research something like media freedom, election, there are election researchers in Hong Kong at the Chinese U. There's a guy named Ma Nok, for example, who does survey research to study elections. I'm part of a project called the Asian Barometer Survey that does survey research throughout Asia, and we have a Hong Kong team. So, but I think if you get into research which falls athwart of mainland Chinese interests, which has to do with freedom of publishing or, you know, the political regime structure in Hong Kong and stuff like that, you can no longer do that in Hong Kong. And so I think that's the answer to your question. You'd have to do it remotely in some way. We have some practice in doing remote research on China. We used to do that before 1979. It's not as good as doing real field research. So then there's Andrew Arbenz. What do you think about Chinese-born scholars in the US having relationships with the Chinese military if they do? So I think that some of them do and some of them do not. Relationships with the Chinese military is even too narrow a concept because the Chinese government has set up a whole technology vacuuming system where it's not only the military, but it's various research institutes and universities that invite people, not only Chinese people, but Caucasian people from not only the United States, but from Europe and Australia and so forth. So it's a very, very big program to acquire technology that's military or dual use, all kinds of technology, agricultural technology, medical technology from other societies through a variety of methods, many of which are legal, like reading journals and translating them, like investing in foreign companies that possess advanced technology, so you become an owner. So part of that so this question points to just one narrow part of that whole process, which is scholars who are funneling technology of military utility to Chinese military research institutes, and that does happen. But it isn't everybody. So the trouble is with the FBI having this thing called the China, what is it called? China Program or China Project, which sort of casts suspicion on all ethnic Chinese who are researching in American universities and pharma companies and so forth, has a racial bias built into it. But on the other hand, sort of the fault of the Chinese government, which reaches out to all ethnic Chinese around the world, even the second and third generation, and says all Chinese are loyal to the motherland and stuff like that. So this is a, big mess. And so we do need to, our government and our security agencies, the FBI and so on, and universities and stuff need to be on the lookout for this, but without stereotyping every ethnic Chinese person. Rick, what will be the long-term impact of ending term limits in China? So Xi Jinping, after Deng Xiaoping died in 1997, the Chinese leadership practiced a policy of 2 5-year terms for the head of the party, who is the most powerful person in the country. That was not written into the party constitution, but since the head of the party normally served as the head of state, and the head of state had 2 5-year terms, therefore, that was the de facto system. Xi Jinping, at the end of his first 5-year term, had the National People's Congress revise the Constitution to get rid of the term limits in the state constitution, which therefore basically removes the term limits for the party leader as well. And he gives every indication of intending to serve for more than 2 5-year terms. His second 5-year term ends in the fall of 2022, next year. And there's no sign that he intends to step down. If he doesn't step down, he's into a third 5-year term, and then we don't know what his plan might be. Is he going to serve until some particular achievement is reached, or until he dies, or until he has a stroke, or how long is he going to serve? He's now 68 years old, so I guess he's your age. Is that right? So do you want to be the head of state of China right now in your life? Maybe not. I don't. So what one scenario could be that Xi Jinping will make a rational decision to step down at a certain point, and he will appoint a successor, and that'll be cool, and everything will be good. Another scenario is that one day Xi Jinping is walking down the stairs and he trips and breaks his hip and goes into rehab and all that shit. You guys know what I'm talking about. And then there's a power struggle. So we just don't know. So that's the answer to that question. George.
I was asking the question in terms of more or less a hardening of the arteries of the system. Do you see, could it have a hardening of the arteries, as it were, for this Chinese system?
So there was the Brezhnev period in the Soviet Union when Brezhnev was very slow and things slowed down, and there was hardening of the arteries. And yes, that's a good point. Xi Jinping he appears now, and we have very little, certainly in the scholarly world with no classified information, our information is very thin, but my impression is that the intelligence agencies also don't have much information. But from everything that we can see, Xi Jinping right now is very much on the top of his game, and he's very sharp and so on. But you're right. I mean, he could slow down, and then you have this phenomenon where he's very powerful and nobody's willing to go into him and say, boss, you're slowing down. You better retire. Nobody would dare to do that. There's an interesting book that just came out called China Coup by a guy named Roger Garside, a retired British diplomat and banker, in which he says, China has a lot of problems, water problems, demographic problems, debt problems, and so forth. And Xi Jinping might be ousted by a coup d'etat. Interesting, worth having a look at. So that's a scenario, but I can't say whether that's highly likely or not. Should Larry, we're past 1:15. There are some other questions on the chat. Where's Larry gone to?
I'm here.
You're there.
And, I think that this is sort of the grand finale of the reunion. I think it's great if people want to continue and you're willing to continue.
All right, let me take these.
The controllers behind the scenes, it's up to them. I don't see them. But if it's okay with them, I think we should go forward.
They're the secret, what does Trump call it? The secret state or the. Right. All right. George says, we cannot be naive. The Chinese wolf warriors are aggressive and corrupt with every desire to undermine the deep. Saris, the deep state says, go ahead. Chinese wolf warriors are aggressive and corrupt with every desire to undermine us in Venezuela. This has been going on for a long time. You mean that the Chinese have been active in Venezuela buying oil to support the Maduro government? What is happening in the Biden administration to reduce Chinese influence in the Western Hemisphere? Yeah. Yes, so through the Chinese have become the major trading partner of most countries in the world. I think of all African countries, I think of all or most South American countries. They're the major trading partner of Australia. They're the major trading partner of Germany. So just in terms of trade, they are very, very important. And they know how to hurt you if you displease them with their trade relations. Then also with this Belt and Road Initiative, which is in about 80 countries and is pumping money, loans, which may slow down, it may not, all kind of bad things could happen, but it gives them access and makes them very important in a lot of countries. How can the US compete? We really cannot, I think, restore our position as the number one trading partner or the number one. We still are. So one of the problems is that our decision making in the American economy and economic aspects is done mostly by the private sector. Even though the government is very big and Biden wants to raise taxes and invest and stuff like that. But it's still true that if you're going to invest in Africa, if you're going to buy something from South America or sell something, if you're going to buy Venezuelan oil, these are decisions that are fundamentally made by the private sector in the West, in the United States and among our allies. And the private sector is not doing that for political reasons. So even though the United States is still the number one economy in the world, it doesn't have the capacity to launch something like the Belt and Road Initiative at the level of government, and the private sector is not going to take these projects that the Chinese are doing. Pompeo went around, George? Yeah.
No, I was going to say that let's say the United States could invest in, let's say, a country like Venezuela, if Venezuela loses Maduro, but in building electric cars here and textiles, pharmaceuticals, all sorts of things that Venezuela did before and have stopped, and substitute Venezuelan production for stuff that we used to buy from China. But not just in Venezuela, do it in Brazil, do it in Argentina, do it all over Latin America. So we would achieve two things there. One, not buy from China ourselves. Two, create a better relationship with Latin American countries.
So the subject of your sentence was the United States. But who are you referring to? Are you referring to Ford Motor Company?
Well, no, let's say Ford Motor Company had a plant here in Venezuela, so did General Motors.
And what happened?
Closed. But we could be building.
Why were they closed?
Well, basically because of the politics of the Chavez and Maduro.
So then why would they go back there?
Well, that's the whole thing.
Right.
That's just an example of what could be done if Venezuela changed. But
Right. So the Chinese are in Venezuela because they are willing, their government, so their government is willing to take risks that our private enterprises are not willing to take.
No, they're just here taking our raw materials. That's all.
Yeah.
I mean, cobalt, whatever. I mean, rare earth metals. They're not interested in helping Venezuela come out of its whatever you want to call it, but it's disaster.
Yeah.
They're just interested in getting from Venezuela what they're interested in, and that's it.
Do we still buy Venezuelan oil? I mean, I still see Citgo gas stations around.
The Citgo gas stations are under Guaido, really, as far as I know. They're no longer, and they're also franchises. They're not owned by the Venezuelan government.
But do we buy Venezuelan oil?
I think that has been reduced to practically zilch.
And that's for political reasons?
That's for political reasons.
Right. So again, the Chinese trade relationship is not conditioned on political considerations. So when the U.S. stops buying somebody's oil for political reasons, or U.S. companies don't want to go in like to Sudan because it's too dangerous, the Chinese can go in. So they're sort of picking up the residuum. And so your question, what can we do about it, is I don't think we can do anything about it, because, so that's my answer anyway. All right, Josh.
Okay.
Is there a realistic way for the U.S. effectively to counter the Chinese government's economic initiative, African, Latin America, for example, that deliberately ignore or downgrade the importance of human rights concerns? So this is kind of the same thing that we're discussing now, which so Pompeo created a public-private partnership, and I forget the name of it, in which he said the US government will guarantee, I think it was like $311 million of investment by American private firms in some place or other. And this was a ineffective counter to the Belt and Road Initiative, first of all, because of what we've just mentioned, which is a public-private initiative requires private enterprises to see a profit opportunity. And secondly, because $311 million is chicken feed compared to the estimated and rumored $1 trillion of Chinese commitments under the BRI. So the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, there's a lot of criticism that, these are just loans and they're at a commercial rate, and you're sending Chinese laborers and Chinese cement, and we don't benefit, and you're creating environmental problems. And so in the recipient countries, there is criticism. toward Chinese investment, but you have all these criticism, but the Chinese are saying, it's money. Do you want this money or do you don't want this money? And Pompeo comes along and said, don't take their money. And the recipient country is saying, okay, where's yours? And Pompeo says, here's a few pennies, public-private partner. You know, it's not competition. So I don't think, so the Biden people have articulated the idea that they and the Japanese and others would build infrastructure that's better. It's going to be higher quality. It's going to be environmentally conscious. It's going to be financially sustainable. There'll be a real, you know, credit worthiness analysis and all that. It's better. That's their claim. I don't think that's going to really unseat the Chinese from their projects, which in the end of the day are better than nothing for the recipient countries. Okay, I think we sort of.
Chinese are corrupting.
Sorry, say
what? Excuse me. No, the Chinese are corrupting everywhere they go. I mean, they make Latin American corruption look naive, or you know.
Yeah, I know, but if you're the government of country X and the Chinese are coming in and paying bribes, that's a good thing for you. So, I mean, I think that we need to point that out, and our media have been good at pointing it out, and our government needs to point it out and stand up for the evolving standards that the World Bank and others have developed for what's a good investment. But if the question is that going to shake the Chinese out of their nests in Africa and South America? I don't think so. I think they're going to continue to be welcome there. So Larry, I think we reached the end of the chat.
Okay, so Andy, I just have to say, after 40 years of working in Quaker education and going to Quaker meeting, I think it's fair to sum the sense of this meeting that we're incredibly grateful for your energetic and informative and really engaging talk, and all of the support systems that the deep state has provided, the Columbia deep state has provided.
Right.
Possible. And the spirit of the class of 71 is just so moving and outstanding. So thank you so much.
Thank you. So I'll see you guys at your 60th reunion, okay?
All right.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
October.
Halavai.
Okay, bye-bye.